Can you figure it? Can you help us out in terms of, you have any ideas or suggestions as to how we might be able to cut down? Because that to me seems to be a lot of money that could do a lot of good things for a lot of areas in this nation. But $55 billion, that's B as in boy. You know, that's a lot of money. So you have any ideas what we might be able to do as a committee here to sort of bring about some changes to be able to prevent this from happening?
Well, one thing, Mr. Chairman, and you and the other members.
Could you pull the mic just a little closer to you there, I think?
One of the things that you've done today is an example of what can happen, and also has gone on with the GAO and with the Accountability Board, is paying attention to an issue such as the waste, fraud, and abuse up front. Often hearings like this or a review by an IG is done well after a contract is closed and the implementing agency doesn't have time to make a mid-course correction. So constant reviews, while often seen as burdensome by the implementing agencies, do give us the opportunity to make sure as we move forward that we can prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. And in your opening remarks, you also made a very important point. The Act provides a lot of funding to federal agencies and to federal IGs for oversight, while there's not a direct allocation to state auditors or state governors' offices, who are all under very tight fiscal controls, or to mayor's offices, under tight fiscal situations, to hire contractors or additional staff to help us. Similar to the city, we're going to bring in independent outside consultant firms and auditors, one or more, to help us. But we're scraping within our own funding to provide that, while on the federal level, those monies have been provided out of the Recovery Act to the agencies.
Right. Yeah. Deputy Mayor.
Yeah. First, let me state that it's Mayor Bloomberg's intention, and he will do everything in his power to make sure this is the case, that not one penny of stimulus dollars that flows to New York City is wasted. The mayor is very appreciative of the influx of funds that is going to New York City because of this legislation, and he is going to do everything in his power to make sure that the trust you have placed in New York City is not undermined. We believe in New York that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and to that end, what we have done voluntarily is put, and will continue to do as programs are funded, is put as much information on the internet as possible. And we've already started in our public announcements to try to put out as much information about the grants as we can. We announced $260 million of transportation funds for streets and bridges in New York City, and the press release went on for 30 pages, talking about how much each project was, when we thought the ground would be broken. So we are going to put out as much information, and we will be judged by the public, by the Congress, by the media. And that is one of the things that we voluntarily done and are going past the federal requirements. We've also will spend non-stimulus dollars, as I mentioned, hiring an accounting firm, so that we have somebody on our behalf that's independent, scrubbing our books to make sure that we're not doing anything inappropriate and that every dollar is accounted for. We do not want to embarrass the Congress or the President by allowing fraud or misuse of funds to take place. So those two steps we would certainly provide more information about, but also encourage this panel to make sure that others take similarly transparent steps.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now yield to the ranking member from California, Congressman Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gilchrist, when you said, rightfully so, that there was no money in the stimulus bill for your portion of the deal, of the oversight, I had to muse a little bit, because you said there was a lot of money for oversight on the government side. Now, I'm just an old-fashioned businessman, so bear with me for a moment. If you took $1 billion out of the $787 billion, you put it into a very conservative T-bill-esque, maybe California tax freeze, you'd make 5% a year. $1 billion would give you $50 million of income a year if you just took $1 billion. The total allocation for oversight at GAO was $25 million. So you wouldn't get half of what you'd get on $1 billion in a bank for a year. It's a very, very small amount, and General Devaney has an authorization for, I think, 30 staff members. He doesn't even have them yet. So I'm very concerned that although it seems generous from those of us who earn a little bit of money looking up, it's really very little relative to the size of the pie that we're going to be asked to oversee. I've got a couple of questions that are particularly germane here, and I'm glad both the state and the city are represented. Mr. Gilchrist, have you ever been in a meeting in which there was a discussion, or have you heard of a meeting in which there was a discussion about how federal stimulus dollars could be used for already budgeted projects, which would then free up those dollars to be used elsewhere, state dollars to be used elsewhere, by plugging the federal dollars from stimulus in for that use?
Well, I think that's a multi-part to that question, Congressman, because as we've moved forward with, for example, transportation programs, in order to meet the federal requirements and to meet the time frames, we have taken projects that were in original programs that were created either for the State Department of Transportation or the Metropolitan Transportation Authority that could not be funded because of the cost overruns over the last several years, where we explained.
Right. And I appreciate that, and I'll narrow the question to make it easier. Let's look at the transportation ones. Were there on budgets at the time that Albany was viewing the governor's budget, were there projects which were in the budget, which are now these shovel-ready projects, being allocated federal funds to do them?
Yes, and the state funds and the governor.
And then the state funds were used elsewhere.
No, and then the state funds will be reprogrammed to transportation projects, and the governor has signed the required maintenance of effort requirement for the next year's budget that meets the requirement in the Accountability Act.
So following up with this,
there was a slowdown in the fall of state spending on all areas of government.
yeah, and I understand that. And the reason I ask that, because I happen to have my wife's first cousin living here 3 blocks away, and she's watching your hospitals not get full funding and finding themselves being closed, even though stimulus dollars are being allocated. And what she's seeing is the total dollars coming in are the same.
No. This is a federal hearing, no town hall meeting.
But it's important to me, because what I see from an oversight standpoint is it's very clear that my home state of California, the state of New York, the cities within the states had budget deficits. We filled some of those budget deficits. No matter how much we said it's got to be allocated a certain way, the truth is where it's being allocated, it's not a net increase. And isn't it true, and I try to be narrow, isn't it true that many of these programs were obligations? So you couldn't have not funded them if nothing came from us, and yet they didn't get plussed up even though you're using federal funds. Isn't that a reasonably fair statement? Just a yes or no. Please. Followed by a comment.
Well, okay. Yes and no, because you need to work through each one of the different programs. And the state had a very difficult challenge in that we were one of the first states that had to implement our budget 6 weeks after the Recovery Act was passed. Okay. And we'll be and to be fair, to issue a report, because some of the questions have been how the FMAP money was allocated in the budget.
Well, I've got one final question.
Several areas.
One final question. I'll let you answer both together with the chairman's indulgence. For both of you, since it's very clear that there is money shifting in order to meet these requirements, isn't it fair for the federal government, and particularly this committee, to demand not just a recognition of where the dollars went, but a detailed analysis of the shifting that went on, so that as we see dollars at a par level to hospitals and we see dollars moved elsewhere, isn't it fair for us to know whether that stayed within the healthcare system, whether it was diverted to other shortages, and are you prepared to deliver us that kind of explanation over and above the initial requirement that you tell us where you spend it? Can you tell us all the shifting of the sand that is going on with the money, the other money?
Yes, on Friday.
And will you?
Yes, on Friday. On Friday or early next week, we'll be sending out the fiscal report early required for the implementation of the state budget, and that will detail how the recovery funds were used. It's just, Congressman, indulge me for a minute. It is interesting to be answering your question about whether or not the money was used to offset other things, while we've been widely criticized since April 1 for the size of the increase in our overall state budget, which is because the recovery funds were listed over and above the normal spending. So, but we will be issuing a report on our state budget, and we will make sure that the committee gets that report.
And the city.
Mr. Ison, not only do we believe it's fair for you to demand that, we've already voluntarily started to do that. The $260 million in transportation money directly received by the city funded 8 projects that were already funded by city dollars. So what we did is we programmed the federal money, the stimulus money, to those 8 projects, and took the $260 million that was freed up by the stimulus and allocated towards 25 other projects that didn't have the funding to go forward. And also didn't meet the criteria because of the time deadlines, being shovel-ready, et cetera, to be part of the stimulus program. Sometimes there are federal reviews required, environmental reviews. There was, I think, a 180-degree window. So projects that would have fallen outside that window but will still get the benefit of funding. And we will do that with every other program. For example, we were able to work out with the state an arrangement to save 14,000 teaching positions in our city schools because of stimulus funding. And that money will stay within the school system. So in short, not only do we think it's fair for you to demand, we will work with you to do that so that there's no 3-card Monte being played here with the funding.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Now I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich.
Mr. Schuyler, how long will it take you to spend $4 billion?
We believe we'll spend the $4 billion over 2 years. Over 2 fiscal years, and that's on the expense side. On the capital side, we'll have about $1 billion. There is $250 million in transportation, as I mentioned, about $250 million in clean water, and about $426 million for our housing authority. So, in addition to $1 billion that the MTA will receive. For those, we hope to be breaking ground for the majority of those projects this calendar year. Some of those projects, such as bridge, when we're replacing ramps in the Brooklyn Bridge, are multi-year projects. So some of those capital projects will actually stretch over probably a 2 or 3 or 4 year window. But the expense funding, we are putting, as soon as we get it, the money, we are putting it right into the budget. For example, we've already put in about $250 million of the FMAP money. And we have an allocation for COPS funding, which Congressman Wiener advocated for, that we expect to put into our next police classes if the funding is granted by the Department of Justice. So we're not going to waste any time, and we're not going to save any for later use. As soon as the money is received by the city, we're going to pump it right into the programs it's intended for.
Now, in your programming of these funds, when you say you'll spend it over 2 years, after 2 years, what happens with the programs that receive the money? It's
an excellent point, sir, because what we are not able to do because of our own financial situation is to baseline many of these programs. Most of the city.
You want to explain that in layman's terms?
Yes, sir. The city operates on a financial plan, which means we need to match our revenues with our expenses on a year-to-year basis. And we put forward tax projections over the 4-year window, and we can only afford programs that we have revenues identified to fund them. So stimulus funding, which is over and above those tax revenues, we can only rely on for the 1 or 2 year duration. So after that time period closes, we will not have, in case there's other funding made available, we will not have the resources to continue them.
So these stimulus funds, and this goes into a question Mr. Issa raised, is there any, they're being used to supplement additional spending, they're not substituting for city spending. You're not swapping out the funds and using the funds for anything else, using your funds from the city budget for something else.
What we are doing is using the stimulus funds as essentially as gap closers to continue essential services that we'd otherwise been provided. For example, without the use of stimulus funds, we would have been forced to reduce the workforce of the Department of Education, the pedagogical workforce, by 14,000 teachers. So even though before this economic downturn, we intended to continue those positions, we did not have the money to do so until the stimulus funding came through.
Let me ask you about this. The stimulus money is plugging a $4 billion gap, or helping you address $4 billion in needs. You're the person that goes over these numbers. What are the needs? Are they more than $4 billion? Are they $6 billion? Are they 8? They're 10? What are they? And what are your capital needs? Are they $1 billion? Are they 10? Are they 20? What are they?
I think I can't give you an answer on what our needs are, because what we do is we try to spend within our means. We have a capital plan, a 10-year capital plan, which the mayor will announce later next week. That's about $70 billion. Now that is an enormous amount of money, but it'll have been cut by 30% when he presents it. So we try to fill what our most pressing needs are and match up our resources to it. The federal stimulus, when the mayor presented his budget in January, we had a $4 billion budget deficit. Of the stimulus funding available for this fiscal year, about $1 billion of it was in the form of gap closing through the FMAP money. Other money is being used to keep existing programs afloat or do additional workforce training or other programs that the city wouldn't have the money to do, but weren't contained in the financial plan.
Mr. Chairman, I think one of the things that we hope that we'll be doing with this committee is that we really analyze how much of a stimulus this stimulus package is for the economy. If we're talking about a couple of years, the implication is, and I think the expectation throughout the country is that, you know, if you're going to stimulate something, stimulus isn't something that happens over a couple of years. That's number one. Number two, there's no doubt that New York and other cities across the country are experiencing severe declines in their tax revenues, which is creating huge needs and demands. It may be that this stimulus program is just, you know, is just the beginning and setting the stage for a necessity of going towards general revenue sharing again. The third thing I want to point out is that according to the American Institute of Architects, we need over $2 trillion in repairs for our infrastructure, something that local communities aren't going to be able to support. So, you know, that may be an opening for some later spending that may keep a stimulus going and may find us a way to get these shovel-ready projects going to really move the economy like FDR did in the 30s when we had a New Deal that built a lot of this community. Thank you.
Point well taken. Yeah, point well taken. At this time, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to Congressman Platts from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank both of our witnesses for your testimony. And as I said in my opening statement, one of the most important responsibilities we have as public officials is being good stewards of the American people's funds. And each of you in your respective roles at the city level and the state level play a critically important role in that sense. I want to first follow up kind of the line of question my colleagues on the use of the funds to supplement, not replace, state level, so that we truly have a benefit, an increased, an enhanced benefit, not status quo. Mr. Schuyler, you laid out pretty well what the city's doing with the transportation funds. You took the 260 funded shovel-ready projects and then took the city's 260 million and moved that into 25 additional projects. Is it fair to say that we will see that same approach statewide, Mr. Gilchrist, that yes, at the end of the day we're going to see you had these projects, you move federal money in, and X number of additional projects are added?
Yes, on the transportation side, we operate on a 5-year program, and one of the things we're tracking on all of the projects that are selected is whether or not they were part of the original 5-year program, and if they were, then how are the funds reprogrammed similar to the way that the city had come forward. It's a little more cumbersome for us because we're working through 13 metropolitan planning organizations and countless municipalities doing the same thing the city is, but that is part of our tracking.
I think the only member of Congress, or one of the few, that I'm actually a member of the MPO in my local community from my State House days, and actually enjoy transportation issues immensely, and glad to be part of that effort. One of the concerns, and I haven't seen it in my region, but I have seen it in Pennsylvania, that some of the projects are moving, or painting bridges, because of the time frame restraints, that we're moving projects that are not the substantive type of infrastructure projects that ultimately are going to have a long-term benefit, but are because of the short time frame. Is that a concern you have here in New York?
Well, one of the concerns that have been expressed about the projects that are picked are that many of them are projects such as bridge painting, culvert repair, minor repaving, and minor bridge repair. But I'd like to point out two things. One is all of those are, and I'll turn them to my transportation wonk here if you don't control me. All of those are very important things that any kind of an asset management system would tell you that are investments that you should make. But second, going to the stimulus portion of the program, they are all very labor-intensive jobs and get people to work. There's not anything much more labor intensive than replacing a culvert or painting a bridge or crack sealing a highway. And that puts people to work, which, the $1 billion that New York State, or $2 billion that New York State got for transportation is not going to take care of our backlog. It's going to allow us to get projects out there now and people to work.
And I actually share the opinion that those maintenance type projects that long term maybe prevent further or more substantive work having to be done because you're doing good maintenance. You kind of touched on a next point for both of you. In both of your testimonies, you touch on the issue of common methodology being important when it comes to job creation, job retention numbers, because our goal here was 3.5 million jobs created or retained. You both touch on that the way I read your testimonies is that you've yet to see firm guidance from OMB or GAO of how to establish those job numbers. And in fact, I think one or both of you say that perhaps the approach should be you provide all your raw data and let OMB then assess what your job creation numbers or retention numbers are. Could you expand on that, and what, if any, additional guidance have you been given by GAO?
Well, I believe our guidance is actually coming from the individual agencies. For example, on the transportation side, we use the federal transportation formula to calculate about 25,000 jobs would be created by the transportation projects the city is going to do, and those obviously will be construction jobs. On the Housing Authority, we don't money, which is about $430 million or so. We do not have comparable guidance from HUD on how many jobs that would create. So we're trying to go through the different types of work to make those calculations. And on our website, we have a tracker of how many jobs have been created, and we want to make sure that those numbers are accurate. Some of these are easier to measure. For example, COPS funding is going to fund police officers. It's straightforward and easy to count. The education money that we got with the governor's help that saved 14,000 teaching positions is easy to count. Construction jobs are a little more subjective. So any guidance we can get from a centralized source would be incredibly helpful.
And I agree with that. We really think that's where the federal government can be very helpful in providing that on both the direct, but importantly, the indirect jobs that are created.
Is there any ongoing dialogue with OMB or GAO, maybe at the state level specifically?
We've been having dialogue with OMB and the guidance with the agencies, but one of our recommendations would be that something that OMB really take control of and not necessarily leave it to each agency to come up with that information.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, I yield to gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
Thank you very much, and I appreciated your testimony. There's three issues that keep coming up about the stimulus. One is the confusion, Mr. Chairman, that so many people have about whether the money is there for their particular program, and I think all of us just have to do our best to explain what the limitations are on what sounds like an infinitely funded bill. Secondly, to stop fraud, and I think both of you outlined very good procedures to try to stop it and be on top of it. And the third issue, which we've been starting to talk about, which I think is the most challenging, is how do you make it effective? I mean, once you go beyond the categorical programs like on FMAP, how do you make it effective? And I guess I'd ask each of you two questions. One is, how do you make it effective? What are the points that each of you focuses on in the implementation? I mean, you started mentioning maintenance projects, which I happen to agree with. It's visible, it's labor intensive, it's consistent with the goal. But do you have each of you have some comments about that? And then secondly, how do we measure effectiveness so that we can make it, so that you, frankly, can make mid-course corrections, because it's got to be done at the delivery level, not at the Washington level. And I'll start, I guess, with you, Mr. Gilchrist.
Well, on the state level, what we're trying to do is take a look by program to go through for what our measures of the objectives for spending the money and our measures of effectiveness. We talk a lot about the transportation money because that has the earliest deadlines, but for the water and sewer funding or any of the other funding that comes through by formula, we're asking each agency to make sure that they articulate and get out on their website for public comment what their criteria are. What are the type of water systems that are funded sooner? How much attention is paid to energy conservation versus other issues and the job creation issues, and let each agency do that. We're also asking, like the New York State Energy Research Development Authority, who's doing our energy program and putting together their plans, to outline ahead of time what their objectives are. One of the last point you hit on is in public policy. One of the more difficult ones is finding those effective performance measures to go through and do that. But we are asking through our cabinet structure for agencies to go back out and be simple in what their measures would be beyond the job creation or the job retention program.
Thank you. Mr. Schuyler?
I think for us that starts at the inception, which is in our oversight group. Every deputy mayor that wants a stimulus funding for a program needs to present it to the working group and justify the funding. We haven't carved up the pie and given it to our colleagues and said, okay, this is your amount, this is your amount, do with it what you wish. Internally, there's oversight to make sure that the needs are real. Some of the programs lend themselves to efficiency measures better than others. For example, we'll get about $80 million in energy efficiency. Now, we have auditors in place because the city invests in energy efficiency already, so that we can tell what the payback is for the $80 million worth of projects, and we'll be able to measure them as time goes by, whether it's a lighting project, a cogeneration project, hybrid vehicles, how much money the city has saved. Other things such as Workforce Investment Act and job training, we'll be able to measure how many people were trained. So we are endeavoring to create metrics for each of the different categories, and there are obviously dozens of categories, and some of them are more of a challenge. But at the inception, what we want to do is make sure that none of these are done in the back room, that every person in the administration that's involved in this process is comfortable with where the money is being spent, and that we have that internal accountability. And then when decisions are made, we're externally accountable.
Thanks. And the final question, what suggestions, concrete suggestions, do you have for what we can do in Washington to make it more likely you'll be successful here in New York?
Keep sending it.
I think keep sending that and try to make sure that there's some consistency in the guidance that goes through, and that the federal government does what it often does well, which is to share the information across the the states. So when you go through your hearing process and you pick up on a good idea, you get it to us so we can also look at implementing it.
Right. We are chomping at the bit. Not just for the funds, but for the information from the federal agencies on how to spend the funds. They all have rigorous guidelines attached to them. And although we started meeting and deciding where we wanted to fund programs, we don't know whether those programs are eligible until the relevant agency puts out the information. As I said before, over half of the programs don't have the guidelines, the guidance, the deadlines out there for us to judge. So we can't make the internal funding decisions where to take advantage of the money until that information comes out. So as far as maximizing the effectiveness of the money and really stimulating the economy, if stimulus is the intent and speed is a part of that, then as soon as the federal agencies can get that information to us, we will take advantage of it.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and gentlemen, yield back. Let me just take a moment just to introduce a person that served on this committee for 24 years, Congressman Major Owens. Yeah. And he's from Brooklyn. Let me start with the second round of questioning. You know, as I move around, companies, small businesses, they're complaining. They're saying that we have no opportunity, we're left out, you know, what can we do? When you talk about stimulus, they don't mean us. Now, what can we do to grow small businesses and at the same time meet your deadlines? And I understand that, you know, it's time sensitive and all of that, but what can we do to be able to let the small businesses come in? Because they're saying that you're only talking to the big guys.
One of the challenges we face, Congressman, and I think we need to work on, is getting information out in the community early about what's going on so that there will be that contracting opportunity through the primes. If we're going to move as much as this through a competitive bidding process as we can, which helps us with the waste, fraud, and abuse in the standard contracting process, we, at a state level, are struggling on how to do a better job of getting out not only to the state job bank where the jobs are, but information for the small businesses so that they can work with the other contractors and be suppliers. And that's one of the challenges we're facing as we're moving forward. And one of the things we really need to learn is, as we put this first set of contracts out, with a lot more coming, what can we do in that regard?
Mr. Scholar, thank you. Mr. Gilchrist. Deputy Mayor.
We have on the private side, the greatest opportunity for us to get small business involved is on construction. Most of the expense funding goes directly to city agencies for public employees, whether it's the education money, whether it's the FMAP money, and most of the grants are essentially for city, existing city programs. There are contracting opportunities in the nonprofit sector, and we have, and the Mayor Bloomberg announced last week, one person in the mayor's office who is going to be basically the outreach coordinator to the nonprofits, so that any nonprofit in the city that has a question about getting a contract with the city, whether it's stimulus related or not, will have one person to call and not get lost in the morass of 30 or so city agencies with different contracts and different opportunities. This person will be essentially a one-stop shop. We are continuing to work with the City Council and with our partners in the construction industry on MWBE programs to make sure that everybody, to the greatest extent possible, benefits from the at least $1 billion in construction funds that stimulus is going to pump into the economy. And that's been a priority of ours since the beginning, and we'll continue to do that.
All right. Thank you. The recovery.gov website states, OMB does not plan to issue formal guidance directly to state or local governments, but agencies should seek to do so as appropriate for potential infrastructure projects funding through their programs. Does it concern you that the guidance on stimulus funding may come down from the individual agencies instead of one uniform guidance document? Is that
in certain regards, particularly towards the job creation and the tracking and the reporting, I think the state would prefer that we had central guidance. While
talk directly into the mic.
I'm sorry. While for certain ideas such as job creation, the reporting requirements, some of the overall contracting requirements, we would prefer central guidance rather than to have to deal with multiple agency requests. And the agencies, we believe, are best left to the specific roles, such as the governing of the water and sewer funds and those specific responsibilities, rather than the overall reporting type guidance that we think should come centrally.
For us, a lot of these programs are existing programs or programs that existed in the past. So, for example, the COPS program, we have a relationship with the office in DC at DOJ that administers the program, so that there are relationships from people that have worked at the city, spanning administrations, and people in the federal agencies that have worked spanning different administrations that actually administer the programs, so that there is existing infrastructure to move things forward. So we can live with the existing system. You know, as I mentioned before, our main priority would be the speed of the information getting out, and if it's not, and since the administration appears to have made the decision, it's not going to be a centralized warehouse of information. It's going to come from the agencies administering them. Then we would just urge them to please, you know, expedite the issuing of the guidance.
Right. Let me ask you: does New York State and also New York City have adequate staff to be able to deal with the situation? And I asked both of you that question.
One of the things that the processes we're going through right now is we have a workforce group set up to deal with every agency so that we can go through and measure their needs, and particularly in the current budget climate, in implementing the program. And we will need to be bringing staffing in some of the agencies.
City government is doing more with less across the board. And although extra resources would be helpful in the administering of stimulus funding, we will do what needs to be done with the existing resources we have. I've redirected people on my staff from other responsibilities to this because it is a priority. Stimulating the economy is a priority, and all the programs within the stimulus funding are, and those are the decisions you need to make in government, what the priorities are. I certainly wouldn't turn away funds if it's made available, but we don't want to take funds on one hand and then complain on the other hand that we don't have enough people to administer them. It certainly would be helpful, but we'll do what we can with what we have.
And I'd like to clarify where we're really looking at positions would be temporary positions such as construction inspection and for direct things. We're not adding to overhead of the agencies.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Schuyler, I'm going to probably focus on you, but it's questions for both of you. You know, I happen to be a child of the Depression. My grandfather worked in WPA projects because for carpenters and cabinet makers there was no work unless you got one of those jobs. And he left behind a legacy of things that actually were built during that time that my grandmother and my mom would tell me about and even go show me. We once went to a museum to see a piece that he had worked on. So I appreciate that there was a model in the Great Depression of federal money used to keep people employed and to keep their skills and keep their work ethic. It's not a measurable item. I'm sure there are figures of how many people were employed under WPA and other programs, but it left a legacy. This summer I was on the West Coast and I drove from Seattle. It was my summer vacation, as go inspect defense contractors and then drive down the coast. The drive down the coast part, I went over bridge after bridge after bridge, all of which were built under WPA. As a result, I think what's different here, the $800 billion is actually bigger than several years of WPA, and yet, if I read correctly, your talk about how many jobs were saved and so on, isn't it fair, Mr. Schuyler, to say that if you move federal dollars into things which you can fund under our rules, and then you move dollars elsewhere, that it's almost selective whether you say, well, you save 14,000 jobs, or in fact that money really went somewhere else and it created 6,000 jobs. Isn't that an accounting nightmare to actually give us a fair assessment? And in a sense, wouldn't you almost take just the number of, X amount per million is what we're going to create, because you're in a position where the numbers you report are where you used our money, but not necessarily where you used the money that was freed up for other projects which may or may not be labor intensive.
I agree with your assessment that it is very difficult to get accurate job estimates. On the construction side, it is by far the simplest task, because we do it all the time for city projects. How much, replacing a ramp on a bridge, how much replacing a sewer main, how many jobs that creates. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what your priorities are, the vast majority of funding in the stimulus bill is actually not for infrastructure. It is
well, we're acutely and sadly aware
right.
That's the case.
And, I don't want to divert the question for something, but Mayor Bloomberg met with the President along with Governors Rendell and Schwarzenegger in March to discuss the reauthorization of the ICE-T legislation, because there is a huge need for infrastructure.
Sure, and we need 5 and 10-year programs. Let me follow up with just a couple of questions. For all those potential contractors for any part of stimulus, because in many cases here in New York and in my home state of California, really what you have is a group of projects you were already doing and a group of projects that you're able to save or do as a result of stimulus. In a sense, there's really no new work for a contractor. These are two pools which, before the stimulus, may or may not have been funded, And now that they've got the stimulus, instead of a $10 billion, $15, $20 billion cut across the board in the state, you're cutting less. So from an expectation, shouldn't the expectation of contractors be, well, it's not going to be as much of a down year because New York was able to deal at a state and city level with its shortfalls. So realistically, don't look for new work. Look for less reduction than you otherwise would have had, and as a result, put your expectations reasonable that there's not a bounty of new opportunities. If anything, it's going to be a little slower this year. Is that fair enough way to put it?
Oh, I agree with the assessment depending on what program you're talking about. The city will receive in fiscal year 2010, according to our latest projections, $6 billion less in tax revenue off of a base of about
So if your total
billion.
receipt is less at the state and the city level the previous year, including stimulus, your net output will be less too.
So what I could do is assure you that only because of the Stimulus Act, the pain that will be felt in the private sector and in the government sector in New York City is going to be considerably worse than it could have been.
Less than it would have been. Let me ask one last question. The chairman alluded to this in the beginning, and I very much support it. Wouldn't you say that one possible legacy of the stimulus, if we're able to allow you to redirect funds or potentially get new funds, would be if, in fact, the federal government and the states and major cities were able to advance the reporting systems, the automation, the computers, and the ongoing oversight, because this isn't the only federal funds, you receive them every year. If we can get a portion of this money allowed to be reallocated or new funds, and I realize that we don't know for sure what we're committing to, but if we could at least create that opportunity, wouldn't one of the best legacies for your jobs be to really, really make a modern leap in the ability to account and report for funding that we all do within government?
Yes.
It would be an amazing legacy because too much in government, the projects are judged by the cost, not of the output. And that is a model that Mayor Bloomberg has tried to get away from, not judging government by how much it spends, but what you get for the money.
And on the accountability, and also what we're discovering is the ability to show the taxpayers all of the sources of funding that are going into their community, where before it was often left to the individual agency. So now we're trying to line up highway, water, sewer, weatherization, and housing projects all together.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right. Thank you very much.